Hello everybody. We're going to start some watercolor illustration techniques now. Here I've transferred from my sketch onto my watercolor paper with a little less detail. And what I have here is a piece of cardboard that's larger than my watercolor paper. I'm going to tape my watercolor illustration down because when I paint, it's going to get a little bit bowy with the paper, and the tape will help hold it down so we don't get any major issues happening. So let's begin a watercolor. After I've put the tape down all around, and I like to cover about the last 1/4 inch of the paper, is I want to have my watercolor brushes, my watercolor set, my palette ready to go, and a cup of water and paper towel. Set it up however you feel comfortable. So we're going to start off by applying some simple washes from the start. This is the way you want to start any watercolor painting. I have a resource photo. If you might have resource photos that would be helpful for you, that would be great. If not, hopefully you've already figured out what type of colors you want to use for your piece. So after I'm all set up here, one thing I'd like to do is take a look at where I'm going to get started, and I want to apply a base wash. And if I'm going to be using multiple colors, I want to wet those areas with just a little droplet of water in each cake right there. These are called cakes. They're just dry paint. I'm going to add a little water just so it's easier to mix them and pick up color later. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to mix a little bit of blue and purple. And this is going to be the base tone that I'm going to do on my elephant. So when I've mixed up enough, this is going to be a little glary right here. But what we're going to do is I'm going to work a light layer here. It'll get better in a second. There we go. So I'm just doing a light overlay of color here. I'm not sure how intense I want to get, so I definitely have more water on the brush than less. And if I want to make sure I get some nice clean edges when I paint, I like to outline with the brush first and then fill in areas after that. So I'm going to constantly drag back and grab the color and bring that across. Dry your brush when necessary if you feel like it's too wet, and you're going to get something like that. Now, I put 2 base layers down just to get a deeper color. I have this bluish purple here. Now this is completely dry. I'm going to do my background now. And I'm going to show you a technique called wet and wet. That's when you want something to be kind of out of focus and almost tie-dye like in color. So I'm going to, you do not need to use this when you do watercolor. This is just a technique that would be good to show anyone who wants to learn it. I go into the area I want to use this effect on, and I'm going to wet it first. You can see the areas I wet and the areas I haven't. So I'm just putting some clean water in those areas. Next, I'm going to take the colors I want to put back there. So I want mine to feel like a kind of a riverside forest. So I'm going to put some yellows down, and then I'm going to interact some cool colors such as greens and blues in there. So I kind of dance them around. It's called wet and wet because we're bringing wet paint onto a surface that's already been wet prior to that. And now I'm going to tip the paper, and I'm going to use gravity to start letting the colors drizzle against each other. This is called, in watercolor talk, this is called bleeding, because the colors literally bleed into each other. And they're only going to go in the areas that I affected with the watercolor to begin with. After I get a little mixture I'm kind of liking, I'll take my brush and I'll kind of work the color into areas that seem to have dried up and aren't allowing the watercolor to move into. So I'm just skillfully just kind of working in there, getting into the edges, again pushing it around. I'm not trying to over mix the color. I'm just trying to create an avenue so the watercolor can float around in those spaces too. And you're going to see that now they start to really move throughout everywhere else. When I tip with gravity, like, it helps pull the colors around, and when I lay it flat, they stay still, and they'll dry like that. So when you do this technique, you got to play around, and when you find a happy layout, just let it lay flat and dry. So I'm just playing around with this, That feels pretty good to me. So at this point, I'm going to let it sit down and dry. Now we're going to layer with some watercolor. My background's still drying, but I can go into a different area of my watercolor. I'm going to go and do some detail layering. So I'm going to take some black, purple, and a little bit of blue, and I'm going to start putting in some shadows. It's going to start pretty dark. This is where some deep shadows are. So I put those in. And while the area is still wet, I'm going to clean my brush, and I'm going to kind of drag with clean water those dark colors around, kind of draw with the paint to create these deeper kind of cool grays. So I'm literally fading out the shadow like that. So this is where we can advance from a flat wash and add layers on top. If you're interested in doing these techniques, take a look at this stuff and you can practice it on a scrap piece of paper. Again, I'm bringing in a darker tone, clean brush, softening it out, and this will give you layers of shadow if that's something you want to introduce in your watercolor. It's not necessary, but it might be something you want to describe with your work. You're able to control watercolor very well, but you do have to let areas dry in order to work in them again. So please be patient while you're letting areas dry. Don't overdo it. So now we're going to add some details the way a painter does. I'm going to show you some drawing details with colored pencil in a little bit, but we're going to talk about doing it more of a painterly way first. There's just two methods around. Again, I'm going to add some details in the darker area. With a clean brush, I'm going to soften. I'm going to start to create the texture on the elephant's ear just by softening out this color. So at this time, I'm not getting more color. I'm just adding a little bit more of a wet brush to it, and I'm pulling around those deep purplish blues I already put in. You can see my background is still pretty wet, so I don't want to go in there. So I have to be very careful about touching the background right now. Sometimes you have to think for a second, be patient, and wonder where you should go next. So I'm going to go on the other side with a little bit of a lighter purplish blue. Start by bringing some drawing and some details, and then I'm just going to come with a clean brush and I'm going to spread that purple around and soften it and get some really nice soft textures that way. You know watercolor paint's wet when it's still shining back at you and it looks wet. I'm going to draw a little bit of the trunk there, soften it in. So I'm looking at the features I want to bring in, and then I soften. And this is again the painter's approach to developing the technique, developing the details. Just softening, adding a little bit more detail. And I noticed that the legs that I did first are more of a steel type of blue, and the head's more purplish. So I'm going to take some purple and I'm going to add it into that layer I did there to help merge and connect the two areas that feel quite different right now. And I'm going to actually take a little bit of blue. So if things are feeling really different over something that should feel all the same, you want to come back and suggest colors and harmonize everything so they feel they're all part of the same. So at this point now, my elephant's feeling like one. So I did need to do that. Okay, now I'm just going to bring in a basic blue for the water, because there's going to be some water behind there, and some great basic green for the foreground, which is going to have some grass. And next, instead of going in with more watercolor, I'm going to actually go with some colored pencil. This is an approach you could do to add some detail to your work with drawing. So I'm going to take my colors, and I'm actually going to create the movement of waves in the river with just a couple different types of blues. So I'm going to make my wave lines and use my colored pencil like I was using a piece of drawing paper. That's going to give me some added details that might be difficult with the watercolor. so I can use more of my drawing ability. I'm enhancing it with a little bit of a deeper blue. And now I'm going to flick lines to create the look of grass. So I have the green watercolor behind it, but now I use these lines to suggest the loose wild grass. And I really bring a lot of texture into the scene just by doing that. This time I'm going to take a little bit of blue, some black, some gray, and I'm going to add some texture to the elephant where maybe the watercolor was going to be it was going to be a little too difficult. If you tend to overdo it, and I feel like I end up overdoing it a little bit on the elephant here, you can take an eraser and erase back your color pencil. It really won't affect your watercolor, but do this on a dry watercolor. Never do it in the wet area. So I'm bringing some line textures in here, and it's good to see what colors you want to use, because I tend to go back and adjust my work a lot, and that doesn't discourage me. But in this, like I feel like in the end I tended to do a little bit too much black, a little bit too much gray. So I'm gonna go back and erase back a little bit. I feel like maybe just adding a little bit of blue and a touch of black would have been the better way to go. So sometimes you have to heal areas. Adding a little yellow into the grass, and a little reflection on that. A little bit of blue there. But I'm going to take my eraser and soften some of those details I brought in. And in the end, after some adjustments and some erasing, I have my finished product right there, where it's a little combination of two different materials. Good luck, everybody. Have fun exploring.